There is a moment, and almost every person alive has had one, where you are sitting in a room full of people, surrounded by familiar faces, familiar songs, familiar rituals, and something deep inside you quietly whispers that something is not right. You cannot name it. You cannot prove it. But you feel it in your chest like a stone that wasn't there before. You look around, and everyone seems fine. Everyone seems happy. Everyone seems to believe. And so you smile. You stand when they stand. You clap when they clap. You push that feeling down as far as it will go. Because you don't want to be the one who got it wrong. You don't want to be the one who doubted. You don't want to be the one who looked at something sacred and called it dangerous. Most people push that feeling down for years. Some push it down forever. But every once in a while, every rare, remarkable once in a while, someone in that room decides not to push it down. Someone in that room decides to pay attention. And what Margaret Caldwell paid attention to inside the walls of Greater Revelation Baptist Church in the summer of 2013 would ultimately expose one of the most carefully constructed systems of spiritual and financial manipulation that a congregation in the American South had seen in over 2 decades. And before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We genuinely love hearing from our community, and if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's get back to Margaret. Margaret Caldwell was not the kind of woman you would describe as naive. She was not the kind of woman who walked into rooms without first reading them, without first cataloging the exits, without first asking herself what the room wanted from her. She had grown up learning to read rooms the hard way. In Tunica County, Mississippi, one of the poorest counties in the entire United States, where she was born in the spring of 1963, the third of 7 children to a father who worked the land and a mother who worked 2 jobs, came home exhausted every single evening, and still found the energy to kneel beside her bed and pray before she slept. That image, her mother's knees on the hardwood floor, hands folded, lips moving in quiet conversation with God, was the image Margaret would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not as a burden, as an anchor. Faith, in the Caldwell household, was not a performance. It was not a transaction. It was not a strategy. It was the most honest thing they had. And in a county where honest things were often the only thing standing between a family and complete collapse, that meant everything. Margaret grew up understanding that the church was not just a building you visited on Sundays. The church was the school when the schools failed you. The church was the counselor when you couldn't afford one. The church was the food bank, the community center, the town hall, the courthouse, and the therapist's couch all folded into one. She loved it completely and without reservation, the way only someone who has seen what a community looks like without any of those things can love it. By the time Margaret was 8 years old, she was already a fixture in the children's choir at their small Baptist congregation, and her voice, clear and wide and capable of carrying a note from one end of a room to the other, made the older women in the congregation stop mid-conversation and turn their heads toward the sound. By 12, she was helping to organize the Sunday school curriculum, staying after service to stack chairs and sweep floors while the other children ran outside. By 16, she was the person the pastor called when something needed to be done correctly, efficiently, and without drama. She was not someone who sought the spotlight. She was someone who understood that the work happened behind the spotlight, and she was content there. More than content, she was purposeful. She was building something in herself that she could not yet name, a combination of discipline and observation and patience that would, decades later, become her most powerful weapon. But that was still a long way off. First came the leaving. Margaret Caldwell left Tunica County at the age of 18 with $40 in her pocket, a change of clothes in a canvas bag, and a bus ticket to Atlanta, Georgia. She did not leave out of ambition, exactly, though ambition would certainly come. She left because she understood, with a clarity unusual for someone her age, that the version of herself she was capable of becoming could not be built inside the confines of a county that had already decided what she was allowed to be. Atlanta in 1981 was not the city it would later become, but it was already a place where possibility felt real in a way that it didn't back home. She enrolled in night school 3 weeks after arriving, while working days as a filing clerk for a small real estate firm in Midtown, not as an agent, not as a secretary, but as the person who made sure that the documents were organized, that the records were accurate, that nothing was lost or misplaced. It was not glamorous work, but Margaret was not looking for glamour. She was looking for information. And a real estate firm, she understood quickly, was a place swimming in it. She watched. She listened. She absorbed everything. The way deals were structured, the way clients were approached, the language of negotiation, the psychology of property and ownership and value. She asked questions carefully, never in ways that made the agents around her feel threatened or outpaced. She was the filing clerk. She was meant to be invisible, and invisible was exactly what she needed to be while she was learning. For years after arriving in Atlanta, Margaret Caldwell sat down for and passed the Georgia real estate licensing exam on her first attempt. Her supervisor at the time, a man named Gerald Hawthorne who would later say he should have seen it coming, described her performance in those early years as quietly devastating. She did not outsell the other agents through aggression or charm or the kind of personality that fills a room. She outsold them through preparation. She knew the properties. She knew the clients. She knew the numbers. And she never once promised anything she couldn't deliver. By 1991, she had her own firm, small, but entirely hers. By 2001, Caldwell Property Group had handled over 60 commercial transactions in the Atlanta metropolitan area alone, and Margaret Elaine Caldwell, born third of 7 in Tunica County, Mississippi, to a tired mother and a hard-working father, was worth somewhere north of $8 million. Self-made. Every single cent of it. She never forgot where she came from. She also never forgot the church. Throughout her years in Atlanta, she had remained connected to her faith, attending services regularly, contributing to her local congregation, serving on committees when her schedule allowed. But it was in 2012 when she made the decision to return to Mississippi, not to Tunica County specifically, but to a mid-sized city 2 hours north, that Margaret began looking for a new church home. She was 50 years old. She was wealthy. She was successful. And she was, those closest to her would later observe, carrying something behind her eyes that success had not fixed. A kind of watchfulness. A kind of weariness. Not depression exactly. More like the specific tiredness of a person who has spent decades being underestimated and has grown exhausted by always having to prove the underestimators wrong. She wanted, more than anything, to find a community where she could simply belong, where she could give, generously, freely, the way her mother had always taught her to give, and not have to perform or justify or explain herself. She thought she had found that place on the first Sunday morning she walked through the doors of Greater Revelation Baptist Church and heard Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield preach for the first time. Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield was, by every account available, a remarkable man to listen to. He was 44 years old in 2013, broad-shouldered and handsome, with a voice that moved between registers the way a gifted musician moves between chords, effortlessly, instinctively, with the complete confidence of someone who has been doing it since childhood. He had grown up in the church, the son of a deacon, trained in theology at a respected seminary, and had been leading Greater Revelation Baptist Church for 11 years by the time Margaret first encountered him. The congregation he had built over those 11 years numbered close to 900 members on a good Sunday, which in a mid-sized Mississippi city was not a small achievement. He was known throughout the region as a preacher's preacher, the kind of man that other pastors pointed their own congregations toward when they wanted to show them what genuine spiritual authority looked like. He was articulate. He was passionate. He was, to every visible measure, exactly what a pastor was supposed to be. Margaret sat in the very back pew on that first Sunday. She listened. She watched. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, like she might have found the place she was looking for. She would later reflect, with considerable pain, that this feeling, this warm, open, immediate sense of belonging, was the very first thing Pastor Whitfield used against her. It did not happen overnight. Nothing about what Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield did happened overnight, and that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him before we go any further. The kind of manipulation that Margaret Caldwell eventually uncovered inside Greater Revelation Baptist Church was not the messy, impulsive, desperate kind of manipulation that gets detected quickly. It was the slow, patient, architectural kind, the kind that is built one layer at a time over years, with enough genuine warmth mixed into it that by the time a person begins to feel something is wrong, they have already invested so much of themselves that the act of acknowledging the wrongness feels like destroying something they love. It is the most effective kind, and Pastor Whitfield had been perfecting it. Those who eventually investigated his methods would suggest for the better part of a decade before Margaret Caldwell walked into his church. In those first few months, he was nothing but warm toward her, welcoming, attentive without being intrusive. He preached in ways that seemed, uncannily, to address the precise things she was wrestling with. He checked in with her after service. He remembered details she had mentioned only once in passing. He made her feel, consistently and convincingly, that she was seen, that she mattered, that her presence in that congregation was meaningful to God and to him personally. Margaret responded the way any person who has spent decades being overlooked responds when someone finally pays attention. She opened up. She began contributing to the church's building fund. She funded a new roof for the sanctuary, which had been leaking for 3 years. She established a scholarship program for young people from the congregation who wanted to attend college. She paid for a complete renovation of the church's kitchen and fellowship hall. Over the course of her first 2 years at Greater Revelation, she donated, in total, somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000 to the ministry. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but consistently, generously, in the way she had been raised to give, because she believed in the work, because she believed in the community, and because she believed, genuinely and completely, in the man standing at the front of that sanctuary on Sunday mornings. And Pastor Whitfield, to his credit, made sure she continued to believe. He praised her from the pulpit. He called her a vessel of God's provision. He prayed over her publicly and with what appeared to be deep, authentic gratitude. He made her feel, Sunday after Sunday, that her generosity was producing exactly the fruit it was intended to produce. But Margaret Caldwell was still, beneath the warmth and the belonging and the sense of finally being home, a businesswoman. And businesswomen, eventually, ask questions. The first question came quietly, in the spring of 2015. Margaret had, by that point, contributed close to $1 million to Greater Revelation Baptist Church over 2.5 years. She was not uncomfortable with that number. She could afford it, and she genuinely believed in what the church was building. But she was also, by nature and by decades of professional discipline, a person who believed in accountability, in transparency, in the simple principle that money given for a purpose should be traceable back to that purpose. She requested, gently, carefully, framing it simply as the responsible stewardship of a significant donor, a full review of the church's financial records. She was not accusing anyone of anything. She was not suggesting anything was wrong. She simply wanted to see the books. Pastor Whitfield smiled. He said he understood completely. He said the ministry had nothing to hide, and that transparency was one of its core values. He said he would have the church administrator reach out to her within the week to arrange access. And then 3 weeks passed, and then 6 weeks, and then 3 months, and the call never came. When Margaret finally escalated her request, this time in writing, sent to both Pastor Whitfield and the church's board of deacons, she was given partial access to a set of financial records that raised more questions than they answered. The records were incomplete. Multiple categories of expenditure were vague to the point of being meaningless. There were discretionary pastoral accounts with significant balances and almost no documentation of how those balances had been used. There was a line item for a mission trip to an international destination that had no accompanying reports, no receipts, and no list of participants. And there were 2 property transactions, both involving a name that Margaret did not immediately recognize, that appeared to have been funded, at least in part, with church money. She sat with those documents for 3 days before she showed them to anyone. She read them the way she read every document, carefully, thoroughly, without letting emotion get ahead of analysis. And when she was finished reading, she picked up the phone and called a forensic accountant she had worked with previously in Atlanta. She did not tell the accountant whose records she was sending. She simply said, "Tell me what you see." What the accountant told her, 2 weeks later, changed everything. The accountant's initial analysis identified financial irregularities in excess of $340,000 across a 6-year period. This was not one large transfer that might have been an error. It was dozens of smaller movements, regular, consistent, carefully calibrated to stay beneath the thresholds that would typically trigger scrutiny. Love offerings that had been publicly raised for specific purposes and privately redirected into discretionary accounts. Renovation funds that had been partially siphoned before reaching the contractors. The property Margaret had flagged, purchased in the name of a woman whose maiden name was later identified as the maiden name of Pastor Whitfield's wife, had been acquired using a combination of donor funds and church reserves with no formal board authorization. The total amount that could be directly traced was $340,000. The accountant told Margaret, with careful professional understatement, that the actual number was likely higher. Margaret thanked him, set down the phone, sat quietly for a very long moment, and then she did something that the people who knew her would later describe as entirely characteristic of her, and entirely unexpected by everyone who didn't. She didn't go to the board. She didn't call the press. She didn't contact the district attorney's office. She went, directly and privately, to Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield himself. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening in March of 2015. The church was empty. The pastor's office smelled of leather and cedar and old books, the kind of room designed to communicate authority and permanence. Margaret arrived on time. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She placed the forensic accountant's preliminary report on the desk between them, face up, clearly readable, and she told him, in a calm and measured voice, that she knew what had been happening. She did not shout. She did not cry. She did not threaten. She stated facts. She asked for an explanation. And what Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield did next, in that quiet, cedar-smelling office on a Thursday evening in March, was the moment, Margaret would later say, that she understood exactly who she was dealing with. He did not deny it. Not outright. He did not apologize. He did not attempt to explain or reframe or offer any version of the numbers that might cast them in a different light. Instead, he leaned forward across the desk, reached out his right hand, and placed it gently against Margaret's forehead. He bowed his head, and he began to pray. He prayed that God would give her a spirit of peace. He prayed that she would not be led by confusion or by the whispering of the enemy. He prayed that her heart would remain open and that her mind would not be used as a weapon against God's anointed ministry. He said, in the careful language of someone who has weaponized Scripture for long enough to know exactly how to deploy it, Lord, protect her from the spirit of Jezebel. He prayed for nearly 4 minutes, and when he was done, he raised his head, looked at Margaret with an expression she described as almost loving, and said, "Sister Caldwell, I believe God is going to use this moment to bring us even closer together." Then he stood up, extended his hand for a handshake, and waited for her to leave. Margaret left. She drove home in silence. She sat in her car in her own driveway for 20 minutes without moving. And in those 20 minutes, something shifted inside her with the clean finality of a lock clicking into place. She understood, with total clarity, what had just happened. The prayer had not been prayer. It had been a performance of prayer weaponized as a tool of control. The laying of his hand on her forehead was not blessing. It was a message. It was a demonstration of hierarchy. It was Pastor Whitfield communicating, in the most ancient and sacred language available to him, that he had access to her body, access to her spirit, access to her mind, in a way that superseded the uncomfortable conversation she had attempted to have about money. He had used the most intimate gesture of spiritual authority to remind her of her place. And Margaret Caldwell decided, in that driveway, on that Thursday night in March, 2 things simultaneously. First, she would never allow him to touch her forehead again. Not once. Not for any reason. Not in any context. Second, she was not done with Greater Revelation Baptist Church. Not even close. Because Margaret understood something about situations like this that most people don't understand until it's far too late. Leaving was the easy choice. Leaving meant the system continued. Leaving meant the next woman who walked through those doors carrying her faith and her generosity and her desire to belong would encounter exactly the same architecture of manipulation with no warning and no protection. Margaret had not built a real estate firm from the ground up by choosing the easy option. She stayed, and she began to watch. What Margaret observed over the following 18 months inside Greater Revelation Baptist Church was, she would later describe, like watching a magic trick in slow motion once you already know how it's done. You can see every hand movement, every misdirection, every moment where the audience's attention is guided away from the thing that's actually happening. She began talking, quietly, carefully, over coffee and after service and in parking lots and in quiet phone calls, to the people who had been there longest. The women who had been in that congregation for 15 and 20 years. The deacons who remembered how things had worked before Pastor Whitfield arrived. The administrative staff members who had left under circumstances that, in retrospect, had never been adequately explained. What she heard, assembled piece by piece over those 18 months, was not just a story about missing money. It was a story about a system. A deliberate, structured, carefully maintained system in which spiritual authority was used to manufacture dependency, suppress questioning, redirect resources, and insulate the man at the center of it all from any meaningful accountability. Multiple women in the congregation had been invited into private, spiritual counseling sessions with Pastor Whitfield, sessions from which several had emerged feeling disoriented, confused, and unable to articulate exactly why, but deeply reluctant to return. A former associate pastor who had raised concerns about financial practices in 2011 had been quietly removed from his position and relocated to another state before he could build any coalition of concern within the congregation. Church members in personal financial crisis had been encouraged, from the pulpit and in private meetings, to increase their seed offerings, with Pastor Whitfield drawing on information shared in the supposed confidentiality of pastoral counseling sessions to personalize the pressure. The laying on of hands, the forehead touch, the gesture of blessing, appeared in multiple accounts as a consistent element, a physical act of dominance repeated at key moments when a member of the congregation needed to be reminded of the pastor's authority over their spirit and, by extension, over their decisions. Meanwhile, on Sundays, something else was happening. Pastor Whitfield, who was not a man who accepted challenges to his authority without a strategic response, had begun to shift the content of his sermons in ways that those familiar with his methods would immediately recognize. The topics became pointed. One Sunday, it was the danger of Jezebel spirits infiltrating the sanctuary, women of wealth and influence who used money to try to usurp God's anointed leadership. The following Sunday, it was a message about the disciples who walked away from Jesus because they could not handle the fullness of the teaching. 3 Sundays later, he preached an entire service on the subject of spiritual warfare within the church, concluding with an altar call in which he invited anyone who felt they were being used by the enemy to bring confusion to this ministry to come forward and repent. The congregation, 900 strong and deeply loyal to a man who had been their shepherd for over a decade, responded the way congregations respond to that kind of preaching. They nodded. They agreed. They prayed. And a quiet but unmistakable current of suspicion began to move through the pews, directed, exactly as intended, toward the woman who had recently begun asking uncomfortable questions about the church's finances. Margaret sat through every one of those Sundays in her customary pew. She sat straight. She kept her expression still. She did not flinch. She did not respond. And she took very careful notes. By the fall of 2016, Margaret had compiled a document that was 67 pages long. It was organized by category: financial irregularities, pastoral misconduct, personnel decisions with apparent retaliatory motivation, and a section she simply titled Pattern of Behavior that cross-referenced incidents, dates, individuals, and outcomes in a way that made the architecture of the whole system visible. She had the forensic accountant's full report. She had written testimony from 4 former employees. She had detailed accounts from 6 current and former congregation members. She had a property deed, a bank statement, a series of internal emails obtained through a former administrative assistant, and a timeline that stretched back not 11 years, the length of Pastor Whitfield's tenure at Greater Revelation, but 17 years, back to his previous congregation in a neighboring state, where a similar pattern had played out with similar results, and where a similar departure had been similarly unexplained. She had done all of this while continuing to attend church every Sunday, while continuing to sit in her pew, while continuing to step back every time Pastor Whitfield moved through the congregation during prayer, his hand rising toward foreheads, blessing the faithful one by one, while the congregation whispered about her pride and her rebellion and her refusal to submit to the anointing. She had done all of this alone, in the evenings, in the study of her home, while the rest of Greater Revelation Baptist Church had no idea that the woman they had been praying against was the only person in the building who had been keeping meticulous records of exactly what was being done to them. On the evening of November 9th, 2016, Margaret Caldwell walked into a special session of Greater Revelation's Board of Deacons. She had not been invited. The board had been called together to discuss what one of the deacons had characterized vaguely as internal ministry concerns, and Margaret had learned of the meeting through one of the deacons who had, over the preceding months, become quietly and cautiously sympathetic to what she was doing. She arrived carrying a leather briefcase. She placed the 67-page document on the conference table. She stood at the head of the table, a position of authority she had not been assigned, but simply claimed with the calm certainty of someone who has nothing left to prove, and she walked the board through the findings for 45 minutes. She was precise. She was thorough. She was, by every account of those present, completely composed. When she was finished, she closed the document, picked up her briefcase, and looked around the table at the 8 men sitting before her. She said, "Gentlemen, you have until Friday morning to handle this internally, completely, and correctly. If I have not heard from you by then, I will be delivering a copy of this document to the district attorney's office." And then she walked out of the room. The board met twice more that week before Friday arrived. On Thursday evening, Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield submitted his resignation to the Board of Deacons, effective immediately. There was no farewell sermon. There was no announcement to the congregation. There was no press release. There was no explanation offered to the 900 people who arrived that Sunday morning to find their pastor absent and an interim minister standing at their pulpit. The board released a single statement citing a mutual parting of ways in the best interest of the ministry. The financial irregularities were quietly corrected over the following months. 2 civil settlements were reached, confidentially, with 2 of the women who had come forward with accounts of the private counseling sessions. The former associate pastor who had been removed in 2011 was contacted privately and offered a formal apology by the board. None of it made the news. None of it was announced from the pulpit. And Margaret Caldwell, who had made all of it happen, did not say a word about it publicly. Not then. Not for a long time after. She simply continued to attend church on Sunday mornings. She continued to sit in her customary pew. And when the new interim pastor moved through the congregation during prayer, his hands extended, his intentions visible and unmixed, she nodded, closed her eyes, and allowed the blessing she had been refusing for 3 years to finally rest on her forehead. Because it was different now. She knew the difference. And knowing the difference, she had decided, was the most important thing. But the story does not end there. Because Pastor Deshaun Marcus Whitfield did not disappear. Men who have spent 17 years building systems of control do not, as a rule, simply dissolve when the system is dismantled. Within 14 months of leaving Greater Revelation Baptist Church, Whitfield had established a new ministry in a city 300 miles away. A smaller congregation at first, but with the gifts he genuinely possessed, and they were genuine gifts, which is the uncomfortable truth at the center of all stories like this one. The new congregation grew. He preached with the same voice. He moved through the pews with the same warmth. He reached toward foreheads during prayer with the same hand. And in the anonymity of a new city, with no connection to the community that had watched him leave, he was, to every visible measure, a man restored. Margaret learned of the new church through one of the women who had come forward during her investigation. A woman who had a cousin in the new city, who had begun attending the new congregation and was sending back observations that sounded, to anyone who had read Margaret's 67-page document, painfully familiar. She sat with this information for 2 weeks. And then she made a decision that, even now, those who know her describe as the choice that defined everything that came after. In the spring of 2018, Margaret Elaine Caldwell established the Caldwell Faith and Accountability Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing free legal resources, financial counseling, and investigative support to church members and faith communities dealing with pastoral misconduct and financial abuse. She did not hold a press conference. She did not seek coverage. She did not position herself as a crusader or a victim or a hero. She simply built the infrastructure and made it available to anyone who needed it. The foundation, in its first year, supported 43 individuals across 6 states. By its third year, that number had grown to more than 200. By 2024, the Caldwell Faith and Accountability Foundation was operating in 14 states, had contributed to the formal removal of 38 clergy members from positions of authority, had provided legal support in 11 civil cases, and had helped establish financial transparency protocols in over 60 congregations. Margaret funded it entirely from her own resources. She sat on no boards that sought public attention. She gave no interviews. And every Sunday morning, without fail, she was in her pew, watching, giving, belonging, on her own terms, with her eyes wide open, in the way her mother had always given without ever once surrendering her dignity. That, perhaps, is the detail that stays with you longest when you learn Margaret's full story. Not the 67 pages. Not the forensic accountant. Not the Thursday evening in the cedar-smelling office, but the image of her mother on her knees beside that bed in Tunica County, Mississippi, in conversation with God. Honest, unmanipulated, completely herself. Margaret Caldwell had spent 30 years becoming the woman her mother prayed for. And when someone tried to use those prayers against her, tried to take the most sacred language she knew and turn it into a tool of control, she didn't run from her faith. She didn't curse the church. She built something that made it harder for faith to be used that way. She built it quietly, the way she built everything. And she kept going to church. Every Sunday. In her customary pew. Stepping back, always, from hands she had not yet learned to trust. And stepping forward, slowly, only when the trust had been earned the way trust is supposed to be earned. Through time, through consistency, through the patient accumulation of evidence that the person reaching toward you means exactly what they say they mean. Margaret Caldwell had a name for that kind of trust. She called it discernment. She said it was the most important gift her faith had ever given her. She said it had taken her 50 years to understand that discernment was not the opposite of faith. It was the fullest expression of it. There are, right now, in congregations across the United States and around the world, people sitting in pews with that stone in their chest, that quiet whisper, that unnamed, unprovable feeling that something is not right. And most of them will push it down. Most of them will look around at the familiar faces and the familiar songs and decide that they must be the one who has it wrong. This story is for those people, not as an instruction to distrust every pastor and abandon every church, but as a reminder, documented, sourced, drawn from the real and costly experience of a real and remarkable woman, that your instincts deserve to be taken seriously. That questions are not betrayals, that accountability is not rebellion, and that the hand reaching toward your forehead, wherever it comes from, should have to earn the right to be there. Margaret Elaine Caldwell knew that, and because she knew it, hundreds of people who will never know her name are safer today than they would have been otherwise. That is what it looks like when one person decides not to push the feeling down. That is what it looks like when someone in the room decides to pay attention. And now, you know why she never let him touch her forehead.